The actor who became president. How Ronald Reagan learned to play America. January 20th, 1981. Ronald Reagan stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, taking the oath of office as the 40th President of the United States. At 70 years old, he was the oldest man ever elected to the presidency, a former Hollywood actor who had somehow convinced America to give him the ultimate starring role. But as Reagan raised his right hand and swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, few people understood that they were watching the greatest performance of his career. This wasn't Ronald Reagan, the man becoming president. This was Ronald Reagan, the character, a carefully crafted persona that had been decades in the making. The real story wasn't how an actor became president, but how a failed, desperate man learned to play the role of his life so perfectly that even he began to believe it was real. This is the Ronald Reagan story that challenges everything. Americans thought they knew about their 40th president, not the sunny optimist from campaign commercials or the conservative hero from political mythology. This is about a mediocre actor who discovered that politics was just another form of entertainment, and that the American people were his biggest and most gullible audience. Because Ronald Reagan didn't abandon acting when he entered politics, he perfected it. For 50 years, he played different versions of the same character, the all-American good guy who always knew right from wrong and never let anyone down. The only problem was that this character was nothing like the real Ronald Reagan, the man who would become the great communicator, started as Hollywood's most ambitious failure. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born in 1911 in Tampico, Illinois, to an alcoholic father and a mother obsessed with respectability. From childhood, Reagan learned that image mattered more than reality, that what people believed about you was more important than who you actually were. Young Reagan was handsome, charming, and completely convinced of his own specialness. He believed he was destined for greatness, but he had no particular talents beyond his ability to convince people he was more important than he actually was. The actor who became president. How Ronald Reagan learned to play America. January 20th, 1981. Ronald Reagan stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, taking the oath of office as the 40th President of the United States. At 70 years old, he was the oldest man ever elected to the presidency, a former Hollywood actor who had somehow convinced America to give him the ultimate starring role. But as Reagan raised his right hand and swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, few people understood that they were watching the greatest performance of his career. This wasn't Ronald Reagan, the man becoming president. This was Ronald Reagan, the character, a carefully crafted persona that had been decades in the making. The real story wasn't how an actor became president, but how a failed, desperate man learned to play the role of his life so perfectly that even he began to believe it was real. This is the Ronald Reagan story that challenges everything. Americans thought they knew about their 40th president, not the sunny optimist from campaign commercials or the conservative hero from political mythology. This is about a mediocre actor who discovered that politics was just another form of entertainment, and that the American people were his biggest and most gullible audience. Because Ronald Reagan didn't abandon acting when he entered politics, he perfected it. For 50 years, he played different versions of the same character, the all-American good guy who always knew right from wrong and never let anyone down. The only problem was that this character was nothing like the real Ronald Reagan, the man who would become the great communicator, started as Hollywood's most ambitious failure. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born in 1911 in Tampico, Illinois, to an alcoholic father and a mother obsessed with respectability. From childhood, Reagan learned that image mattered more than reality, that what people believed about you was more important than who you actually were. Young Reagan was handsome, charming, and completely convinced of his own specialness. He believed he was destined for greatness, but he had no particular talents beyond his ability to convince people he was more important than he actually was. When Reagan arrived in Hollywood in 1937, he was determined to become a major star. He was signed by Warner Brothers and began appearing in B-movies, playing the same character over and over, the clean-cut American hero who always did the right thing. But Reagan's acting career was going nowhere. He was competent but not talented, handsome but not charismatic enough to carry major films. By the early 1940s, it was clear that Reagan would never be more than a supporting player in other people's movies. Reagan's first major transformation came during World War II, when he discovered the power of fictional heroism. While many of his Hollywood contemporaries served in combat, Reagan spent the war making training films in Culver City. But Reagan began telling stories that suggested he had seen real action, that he had been involved in dangerous missions, that he had personally witnessed the liberation of Nazi concentration camps. None of these stories were true. Reagan never left California during the war, but he told the stories so convincingly and so often that he began to believe them himself. More importantly, he discovered that people wanted to believe them too. Ronnie started living in his own movie, said William Holden, a fellow actor who knew Reagan well. He couldn't tell the difference between the roles he played and the life he lived. But instead of people thinking he was crazy, they thought he was fascinating. After the war, Reagan's career stalled completely. But he found a new role, government informant, in 1947. Reagan was elected president of the Screen Actors Guild, a position that gave him access to information about the political activities of Hollywood actors, writers, and directors. During the height of the Red Scare, Reagan became a secret informant for the FBI, providing names of colleagues he suspected of communist sympathies. Reagan's FBI files, released decades later, revealed that he was one of Hollywood's most enthusiastic informants. He provided the government with detailed reports on the political activities of people he worked with, often based on nothing more than rumors or personal grudges. This betrayal of his colleagues served two purposes for Reagan. It eliminated potential rivals for roles, and it positioned him as a patriotic American who could be trusted with greater responsibilities. Reagan learned that destroying other people's reputations could advance his own career. But Reagan's most calculating transformation involved the destruction of his first family, in 1940. Reagan married actress Jane Weeman, who was more successful and talented than he was. They had a daughter, Maureen, and adopted a son, Michael. For a few years, they seemed like Hollywood's perfect family. But as Jane's career flourished and Reagan's stagnated, he became increasingly resentful and controlling. He was jealous of Jane's success and bitter that she was becoming the star he had always believed himself to be. When Jane filed for divorce in 1948, citing Reagan's obsession with politics and his neglect of their family, Reagan was publicly humiliated. The divorce made him look like a failure as both an actor and a husband. Reagan's response was to essentially abandon his children. He saw Maureen and Michael sporadically, showed little interest in their lives, and provided minimal emotional or financial support. But publicly, he continued to present himself as a devoted father and family man. Reagan's marriage to Nancy Davis in 1952 was the beginning of his most successful performance. Nancy Davis was a minor actress whose career was going nowhere, but she came from a wealthy, well-connected family and understood the importance of image management better than anyone Reagan had ever met. Together, Reagan and Nancy created the perfect conservative family image. Nancy gave up her career to become the devoted wife and mother, while Reagan positioned himself as the successful provider and patriarch. But this image was as fake as everything else about Reagan's public persona. Nancy was cold, controlling, and obsessed with status and wealth. Reagan was distant, self-absorbed, and completely uninterested in the day-to-day realities of family life. Their son Ron Jr. later described growing up in the Reagan household as like living in a museum where the exhibits happen to be your parents. Reagan treated his second family the same way he had treated his first, as props in his ongoing performance. Reagan's entry into politics was motivated by failure, not principled. By the late 1950s, Reagan's acting career was essentially over. He was reduced to hosting a television anthology series and appearing at corporate events. At 50, he was a washed-up actor with no prospects and a lifestyle that required far more money than he was earning. Reagan's political transformation began when he started giving speeches for General Electric, promoting conservative economic policies that would benefit wealthy corporate executives. Reagan discovered that he was much better at political performance than he had ever been at acting. The content of Reagan's speeches didn't matter to him. He was perfectly willing to change his positions based on what his audience wanted to hear. What mattered was the performance itself, the ability to make people believe that he was sincere, principled, and trustworthy. Reagan's 1966 campaign for governor of California revealed his talent for political theater. Running against popular incumbent Pat Brown, Reagan positioned himself as the outsider candidate, the non-politician who would bring common sense to government. It was a brilliant performance that disguised the fact that Reagan had been planning his political career for years and was backed by some of the most powerful corporate interests in California. Reagan's campaign was masterfully orchestrated political theater. Every speech, every appearance, every photo opportunity was designed to reinforce his image as the regular guy who reluctantly entered politics to save his state. The reality was that Reagan had no interest in the actual work of governing. He preferred to focus on the performative aspects of the job, the speeches, the press conferences, the symbolic gestures, while leaving policy details to his staff. As governor of California from 1967 to 1975, Reagan perfected the art of political performance while avoiding the substance of governance. Reagan's approach to governing was the same as his approach to acting. Show up, deliver your lines, look good for the cameras, and let other people worry about the details. This hands-off approach allowed Reagan to avoid responsibility for unpopular decisions, while taking credit for anything that went well. When policies failed, Reagan could blame his subordinates. When they succeeded, he could claim the credit. Most importantly, Reagan learned to use his governorship as a stepping stone to national politics. Every decision was made with an eye toward how it would play to a national audience, not how it would affect the people of California. Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign was the culmination of 40 years of perfecting his performance. By 1980, Reagan had refined his political character to perfection. He was the optimistic conservative who promised to restore America's greatness without requiring any sacrifice from ordinary citizens. He would cut taxes, increase military spending, and somehow balance the budget through the magic of economic growth. It was a performance that required the audience to suspend disbelief. But Americans were eager to believe in Reagan's version of reality. After years of economic stagflation, foreign policy failures, and political scandals, they wanted someone who could make them feel good about their country again. Reagan's genius was understanding that most people don't want complicated truths. They want simple stories that confirm what they already believe. He gave Americans permission to ignore difficult realities and focus on comforting myths. But the most remarkable aspect of Reagan's transformation was how completely he convinced himself The his character was real. By the time he became president, Reagan seemed to genuinely believe his own mythology. He believed he had been a war hero, a devoted father, a principled conservative who had always fought for the same causes. This wasn't conscious deception. Reagan had performed his character so long and so consistently that the line between Ronald Reagan, the man, and Ronald Reagan, the persona, had completely disappeared. Reagan's presidency was the ultimate acting job, playing the president while others actually governed. Those who worked closely with Reagan described a man who was often confused about basic policy details, who fell asleep during important meetings, and who seemed more interested in the ceremonial aspects of the presidency than its actual responsibilities. But Reagan was brilliant at the performative elements of the job. He could deliver a speech with conviction, project confidence during a crisis, and maintain his optimistic persona even when his policies were failing. Reagan understood that being president was ultimately about making people believe you are presidential. The actual work of governing could be delegated to others as long as you maintained the right image. The Iran-Contra scandal revealed the dark side of Reagan's hands-off approach to governance. When it was revealed that Reagan's subordinates had been secretly selling weapons to Iran and using the profits to fund Nicaraguan rebels in violation of congressional prohibitions, Reagan claimed he didn't know what his own administration was doing. This claim was probably true. Reagan had created a system where he could maintain plausible deniability about anything his administration did wrong. He focused on performance while others handled the questionable details. But Reagan's ignorance wasn't innocent. It was calculated. By deliberately remaining uninformed about controversial policies, he could avoid responsibility while still benefiting from their results. Reagan's final years revealed the tragedy of a man who had lost himself in his own performance. When Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in the 1990s, some of those closest to him wondered whether the disease was simply making visible a confusion between reality and performance that had existed for decades. Reagan had spent so many years playing different versions of himself, but it became impossible to know which version was real. Had he always been the sunny optimist of his political persona, or was that just his most successful role? The legacy of Ronald Reagan raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of political leadership in America. Reagan proved that Americans would elect someone based entirely on their ability to perform the role of president, regardless of their actual qualifications or commitment to governing. He showed that voters were more interested in how politicians made them feel than in what those politicians actually did. As long as the performance was convincing, the substance didn't matter. Most troubling, Reagan demonstrated that it was possible to succeed in American politics through pure artifice. Reagan had no consistent principles beyond his own advancement, deep knowledge of policy issues, and no real interest in the hard work of governing. But he had something more valuable, the ability to make people believe he was everything they wanted in a leader. This created a template for political success that continues to influence American politics today. Reagan showed that authenticity was less important than the appearance of authenticity. That substance was less valuable than style. Reagan's transformation from failed actor to successful politician wasn't a triumph of the American dream. It was an indictment of American gullibility. Reagan succeeded because he understood that most people don't want their leaders to be complex, flawed human beings. They want them to be characters in a story that makes them feel good about themselves and their country.
But the price of this comfortable illusion was enormous. Reagan's presidency contributed to massive federal deficits, increased inequality, environmental degradation, and the erosion of democratic institutions. But because Reagan maintained his optimistic performance throughout, many Americans never connected these policy failures to their beloved president. Reagan proved that in American politics, perception really is more important than reality. A leader who can control his image can get away with almost anything, as long as he never breaks character. Today, when we look back at Ronald Reagan's presidency, we're seeing both the power and the danger of political theater. Reagan was undoubtedly effective at making Americans feel good about their country and their government. His optimistic vision helped restore national confidence after a difficult period in American history. But Reagan also showed how easily democratic accountability can be undermined when leaders prioritize performance over governance. When presidents are judged more on their ability to look presidential than to actually be presidential, democracy suffers. The real tragedy of Ronald Reagan isn't that he was a failed actor who became president. The real tragedy is that he was a successful actor who never stopped acting, even when the role required him to make decisions that affected millions of real people's lives. Reagan treated the presidency like his greatest starring role, but governing a nation isn't entertainment. When leaders prioritize performance over substance, real people suffer real consequences. Perhaps most importantly, Reagan's story reminds us to look beyond the performance when evaluating political leaders. It's easy to be charmed by politicians who tell us what we want to hear and make us feel good about ourselves. But democracy requires more than good performance. It requires leaders who are willing to tell difficult truths and make hard decisions. Reagan proved that Americans will choose comforting lies over uncomfortable truths, appealing characters over competent leaders, and entertaining performance over effective governance. That's both his legacy and his warning to future generations. Ronald Reagan didn't just transform American politics. He revealed something troubling about American political culture itself. We learned that we prefer our leaders to be actors playing characters rather than real people grappling with complex problems. Until Americans demand substance over style, authenticity over performance, and competence over charisma, we'll continue to get leaders who prioritize looking presidential over actually being presidential. What do you think? Does Reagan's story as the ultimate political performer change how you view modern politics? Share your thoughts about the difference between leadership and performance, and why substance should matter more than style in choosing our leaders. If this story challenged you, subscribe for more untold truths about the figures who shaped America. Because understanding how we've been manipulated by political performance helps us make better choices in the future. Ronald Reagan showed us that in American politics, the best actors win, but the country doesn't always benefit from the performance.